I think we have people here that are not speakers already, right?
Well, I think they're all translators.
Oh,
I think those are the translators, and Diego is the event coordinator.
so they will be translating simultaneously?
I don't know how that works though.
Okay.
To translators, are you able to tell us how the translation is going to work, or is it going to be, are people clicking into a different channel or something? Oh, I can't hear you. I think you're, Patricia, I can't hear you. Maybe you're on a,
And the people can decide for the language. You can speak in the local language and the people decide. Don't worry.
and I don't have to tell them anything about that. All right. So if people want in Portuguese, they've clicked onto a different channel or something.
I think it's only Spanish, English, and, well, I guess Portuguese is the other one. Yeah.
Diego, is there, like, if I get a question, what should I tell people that wanted translation? What are they supposed to do?
It is a menu for questions and answers down of the screen, and the people can test this.
Okay, are we, so are we live right now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So we should start. Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome. I guess we've been starting for a couple of minutes here, but I think people are probably also just coming. But we have a very short time together today. It'll just be exactly 50 minutes because these meetings are going one after another. So I'm going to go ahead and begin and give you the introduction and the lay of the land. Because we're on a Zoom webinar, it won't be possible for participants to speak during the meeting. And if you want to ask a question, I would ask that you use the Q&A button at the bottom, and I will try to integrate your questions into today's discussion. But also, I will start a separate Zoom room at the end of this meeting that people that want to engage in actual question back and forth in a Zoom meeting format, I'll share that meeting after this, and some of the panelists, those who are available, will join us, and we can take Q&As there. So, good morning and good afternoon across the world. Our panelists are, I think, in 7 different time zones today. My name is Sean Flynn. I direct the program on information justice and intellectual property at American University Washington College of Law. I'll be your moderator today, and I'll share a little bit of PIGIP's research into these matters as we go. I'm joined here today by a group of official observers at the WIPO Standing Committee on Copyright and Related Rights, who represent libraries, archives, museums, educators, and researchers within that organization. And the Standing Committee, which we'll refer to as SCCR for Standing Committee on Copyright and Related Rights, is the body at the World Intellectual Property Organization that negotiated the Marrakesh Treaty to facilitate access to published works for persons who are blind and visually impaired and otherwise print disabled. And the agenda that launched that Marrakesh Treaty was originally framed as a broader access to knowledge treaty. And the remaining elements of that agenda are to continue norm setting and guidance for those groups, for libraries, archives, museums, educators, and researchers. And then, of course, COVID happened. So the SCCR has not met officially since the pandemic was announced by the WHO earlier this year. The next meeting is scheduled for November, but it's not clear whether that meeting will happen. And the next one after that is scheduled for April. So while COVID challenges the operation of SCCR, it is also highlighting the crucial needs for this agenda. And that's going to be the topic we're going to focus on today. So we're here to discuss those needs, the needs that have been raised by these communities in the SCCR before COVID, but also how COVID draws a brighter light to many of the concerns that this group has long had around the lack of minimum standards for copyright exceptions in the international system. So we're going to have this discussion in two parts. First, we're going to discuss observations of members of this community on how COVID is aggravating problems that have long existed in the system. And then we will turn to some possible solutions. And again, I just note that if you have questions, please type them into the chat and I'll try to incorporate them into my moderation. So we have with us today Jean Dryden, representing the International Council on Archives, Stephen Weiber, representing IFLA, the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions, Nicola Wachter from Education International, Mike Palmetto and myself from PIGIP, Teresa Nobre from Communia in the EU, and Luis Villarroel from Corporation Innovarta, a public interest consulting organization. So as I mentioned, I think we'll start out with defining the problem. And I'd like to start by introducing some of our members, the three members representing large stakeholder organizations. And I thought I'd start with Jean Dryden on behalf of the archives. And as I mentioned kind of in the preview, I just saw, Jean, that you actually wrote your doctoral dissertation on copyright practices of Canadian archives and repositories, and specifically around making those archives and repositories available online, which seems to be almost prescient in the issues we're discussing here today, because what's an archive if people can't get inside of it? Please tell us a little more about what the challenges archives are facing around copyright and access to materials in this time.
Well, thank you, Sean. I actually can speak personally. One of my pandemic research projects was to do some research on, or to write an article on copyright and fire insurance plans in Canada. And that required me to access certain records at the National Archives of Canada, which is in a different city. The first COVID barrier, quite frankly, and the most challenging is, in fact, unrelated to copyright. And that is that as soon as the pandemic was announced, archives closed and staff started working from home. So researchers had three options. They could consult records already online, which is but a tiny fraction of the institution's holdings, or they could send an inquiry about whatever they needed and how to get copies, or they could wait until the archives is actually open to the public, which it still isn't. So I wrote in May, and the staff responding to inquiries, they had no access to records, but they could tell me what box they were in, but they couldn't tell me how many pages I needed. Once the staff returned to work in September, they could actually look at the records, and I was informed that my inquiry consisted of 30 pages and digital copies could be provided. So my digital copies arrived last week, 5 months later. Now, copyright, in fact, did not pose a barrier because Canada's Copyright Act has a very robust set of exceptions for libraries, archives, and museums to make copies for research and private study, as well as for preservation. But many countries are not so fortunate. Kenneth Cruz has analyzed the exceptions for libraries and archives in the copyright laws of WIPO's 191 member states, and his studies reveal a wide disparity in national copyright exceptions for these institutions. Looking at his 2018 study from an archival perspective, 30 out of the 191 nations have no library or archives exception at all. And while a majority may have library exceptions, the provisions may not extend to unpublished works, which constitutes the vast majority of archival holdings. So only a third of WIPO's member states can copy archival material for their users' research and study. This is a monumental barrier, particularly when the institution is not open to the public. I was lucky, but other countries may, other researchers in other countries may still be waiting.
Great, thank you, Jean. And we'll come back to everyone in the next round, talk about, some of the things WIPO could do to actually redress some of the problems. And I think a lot of the, descriptions of the problems will compound each other. But Nicola, let me shift over to you. I think Stephen Weiber is going to join us in just a moment, but isn't quite online yet. But so Nicola, you're a research officer at Education International, the world's largest federation of teachers unions. Please tell us what copyright challenges teachers are facing around the world in this moment where many kids are prevented in many cases from even entering a school building.
Yes, so thank you very much, Ron. Happy to be part of this discussion. So yes, indeed. So I think the the COVID pandemic has really pushed forward like a big debate also in the education sector of what we need to do to improve the situation and increase access to works for teaching, learning, and research. It has been a historic disruption for education and research, and with really drastic changes, a lot of investments have been made into digital technologies. But what education institutions are realizing that this digital divide and the challenges with the technology doesn't stop there, but it's actually really that when you don't have the works to work with, you cannot access materials, then these technologies remain an empty shell, and it's not really possible to provide the quality in the modern education that we need. And I think existing injustices and inequalities have been exposed, but also new challenges have been exposed, and that has been quite interesting. And I think, even in normal times, it has been challenging for teachers. But examples we have seen now is that suddenly when teachers are doing the same activities they have been doing in the classroom, they do it online, and they have extra barriers and additional obligations they have to fulfill. When they read a story to children, they suddenly also have to name the publishers. They have to be very clear of how they communicate these things to the public, and that's just that's just very strange to us, and something that we should look into, that we suddenly, as soon as we move online, we make everything more complicated for teachers, and teachers have been going beyond and above to ensuring quality education during COVID, and this has just like added additional barriers that are not necessary. Then you also can imagine probably teachers are piling up books and materials in schools and at home. So when you come to teachers in their office, you will see there's a lot of material, but it's not online. So the big question, can you copy them? Can you load them up? And can you upload them? Can you share the emails, the materials via email? Like all these things suddenly become super complicated when actually they shouldn't. It's the bread and butter work of teachers. Then of course there are issues for research, and Jean has already shared some examples, and there we are very much linked to with the archives and libraries of how researchers have been facing challenges of accessing materials. Also when libraries are being closed, and many students and researchers go to libraries, and suddenly that's not possible. That has been a challenge, and some actually, because publishers have been in some instances been so kind to provide digital access to materials, they feel, oh, this is actually possible, I can actually do my work. So, but this of course was only an exception, and I will get back to this later, what sustainable solution might be. But other examples of text and data mining, I think we have seen many examples how important this can be to find solutions to the problems of today and tomorrow. And we don't have provisions for text and data mining in countries all over the world. So these have been some of the challenges for researchers. But then, of course, we also have children with disabilities and teachers with disabilities. We have the Marrakesh Treaty, which isn't ratified in every country and implemented, and children have faced difficulties accessing these materials. If we would have a good law, an international law that would facilitate the exchange of materials, that would make things so much easier. And it's particularly important in a time of crisis when marginalized groups are more and more excluded from discussions and don't have access to all the information they need to contribute to society and take part in daily life. And then, of course, we have students and researchers who have been stuck abroad, who have been stuck at home, but we really actually take courses abroad. And I think there have been many challenges as well in terms of not knowing which materials they can access to, uncertainties with universities, what can be shared, what cannot be shared, because laws differs across the countries. And that's why we think as an international organization, seeing all these problems, that it's so important to find an international solution. That's also why we at WIPO, with many of you on the panel, but also probably some of the participants, and we think it's so important. And we know also that the publishers, and I mentioned this before, and other rights holder organizations have been really kind in providing emergency provisions, that it's fine to provide access to materials and lifting restrictions. But of course, this is not a long-term solution. There have been many challenges also with increasing licensing prices for materials. There are many restrictions and added bureaucracy on what needs to be considered. And we really have to make sure that we that we find a good solution. Of course, a balanced one that takes into account the interest of authors, as well as of those who need access, and authors also need access. So we really need to find a balanced solution. So that is just very important. And I look forward to also hear a bit more from the libraries and the other contributors of what they have experienced. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Stephen, let's bring the libraries now. I mean, I think the libraries stand, at a critical point kind of in between the preservation and archival function of archives and the education and research function of educational institutions. So it's a nice place to bring you in. What kind of problems are libraries seeing in particular during this COVID crisis and in relation to copyright?
So thank you for the floor, Sean. I think your point about libraries being sort of sitting between means that to a large extent they're of course struggling from both sets of problems, both in their heritage, their preservation role, in making sure that they are actually able to take copies of works from the past to make sure that they can be available in the future, and of course that includes the near future, and in their work to support teachers, to support researchers, to actually enable a lot of this work to take place digitally. So I suppose in terms of the three challenges, the three responses I sort of had down, clearly the first is frustration. There is an intense frustration that libraries have legally acquired an awful lot of content, and it is just sitting there behind the doors and it can't be used. And so all that libraries have invested, and often using taxpayers' money, students' money through university fees in order to acquire works, there's no value coming from them. And this is compounded, of course, by the fact that a lot of the time, if you then want to, and especially in the absence of decent copyright laws, if you want to be able to make works available at distance, rather than simply being able to copy them and lend them under many jurisdictions, instead you're offered an even more expensive ebook version or licensed version, which is just doesn't make much sense to pay twice for something from the point of view of libraries. Similarly, there are issues that copies are available digitally, but the way that the subscriptions are set up, they can only be offered on site. And so this is even more absurd that it is possible to do it digitally, just only add a certain IP address. And of course, we're conscious there are efforts to allow off-site access, but so far there are still some pretty deep concerns about whether these actually respect privacy, whether they offer the same level of privacy as you get through on-site access through that common IP address. Similarly, frustration because so many activities that were available beforehand, story times, book groups, discussions, they were perfectly fine. People could walk into the library, take part, enjoy them, but it becomes incredibly complicated to do them online. To the point that we've seen virtual story times starting to take place, and then they get a tap on the shoulder and everything has to stop. We've seen in the UK a fantastic series of programs about access, about books, about encouraging people to read. But of course, the thing they can't include is actually the books themselves, an extract from the books, in order to actually really get people into the subject. Another frustration is linked to the fact that we can see what can be done. So we have those good examples. In some countries, we have a good setup. The US is a good model here, we have rights holders who are showing that they understand what's needed, that they have an interest, we all have an interest in keeping people learning, keeping people researching, but it's not happening everywhere. And it just seems bizarre that a student, a researcher, any library user in one country should have fewer possibilities, should be in somehow a fundamentally different situation to someone in another, and therefore less able to learn, less able to research. Another frustration coming out, another issue coming out now is concern about what's coming on in the longer term. We're seeing the libraries shifting budgets towards digital content, but even before the crisis, the number of loans of an ebook you could get for your dollar, your pound, for your euro was considerably lower than the number you could get on a physical book, lending a physical book. So as the share of digital content lent, used, borrowed by libraries goes up, then we really have a worry about what's happening with overall library budgets. That at a time that we are likely to see spending cuts. And so all we end up is seeing less money going to rights holders overall, but even less content being made available to people. And that's not a good situation for everyone. Of course, this comes on top of longer term concerns, as mentioned, budgets, climate change, those big threats to our long-term heritage.
Great, thank you, Stephen. So that was extremely useful in just putting some of the issues on our map for the discussion. The question of online access, of course, pervades throughout. Can you do the same things online in this environment that you could have done in your building? And the answer across the world is often no. The rights to make core copies, educational copies, preservation copies, the question of how to make available at a distance things like story time, which interestingly implicate other rights like performance potentially and things like that. So I've asked a couple of researchers, including myself, to share a little bit of their empirical research that helps show the prevalence of some of these problems across various jurisdictions. So let me start with Teresa Nobre. So Teresa is a vice president of the Communia Association EU. She's the Creative Commons Portuguese chapter lead. And she's also a researcher, and especially has been doing a lot of research around the scope of educational rights in the EU previous to COVID, but I've asked her to reflect a little bit on what her research tells us about EU in this context today. So Teresa, to you.
Thank you, Sean. So indeed, I have been doing a lot of research on educational exceptions, and I did a lot of research on the European. So previous to the new copyright directive, as you all probably know, that we have a new copyright directive in Europe, and that copyright directive includes a new educational exception for digital uses, indeed. Unfortunately, as we speak, that directive has not yet been implemented except for one or other article in 3 countries. Actually, it has not been implemented in the vast majority of EU countries, which means that the problems that I have seen in my research, which was a lot of differences between exceptions, but also exceptions that didn't provide for the necessary scope. For instance, that to do online uses, you need in Europe a right that's called the communication to the public right, or the making available to the public, which is an essential right to show a video online, to share materials with students by email or through chats and clouds. So that essential right was not there in the educational exceptions of many EU countries before the directive. It will be after the directive. So the directive mandates that all the member states in Europe now need to have an educational exception that provides for the necessary rights to make uses online in the scope of formal educational in schools or educational establishments, but still, so we will have the framework. Right now we don't. So many countries in Europe still lack this framework, and what we have seen, it's actually quite interesting. So for instance, the United Kingdom is the only, it was previously part of the EU, it's not anymore, but I still want to talk about it. So the UK has a fair dealing provision because it comes from a common law system system. And so as a fair dealing provision, and is using this fair dealing provision because it's a flexible provision to deal with online uses. So showing videos, reading materials, sharing materials with the students, is using this provision to make these kind of uses. In continental Europe, unfortunately, we don't have this tradition of fair dealing provisions, so we don't have these flexible provisions, except for 1 or 2 countries that have some flexible, not fair dealing, but still flexible provisions. The majority have quite very specific exceptions that mandate what you can and cannot do. And these exceptions have various limitations. So either they have like physical limitations, they say you can do these uses on the premises of the school. So you are not on the school anymore, you can't do it. So now we are all online, or we are in hybrid systems where some students are online, other students are having in-person teaching or classes. And so these exceptions will not work for those that are still online. Then we have some exceptions with technical limitations. Okay, so you can use maybe the internet of the school, but if the school was not prepared to that, and especially it was a very quick change to online for many schools. They didn't have internet, and now they want to use, clouds or the Google Drive or the Dropbox, or even private groups on social media like Facebook that are private just for the students, and these sort of situations might not be covered in many countries due to this technical limitation. So there was one case, so one country in Europe during the COVID decided to adopt an emergency exception. So Hungary was one of these countries that, as I was mentioning, the educational exceptions were not ready for online education. And what they did was extend the scope of the existing exceptions through an emergency law, and they were able to cover, and they did a very simple thing. Basically, they went through all their exceptions, and they included the right of communication to the public, which is that right that I was telling you that you need to make things online. So they only had reproduction, distribution, everything taught for the offline environment. So they extend the existing exceptions just by adding a new right to all of the existing exceptions. And then, it was supposed to be an emergency law, and they realized that, COVID is here to stay for a bit longer, and probably online education is here to stay for much longer, even after the COVID. So they decided to just turn that emergency law into a permanent law. So that was a case of a country in Europe that did something very quickly, and then changed from one moment to the next their legal framework for education. And it was actually quite good. But I just want to finish by showing a slide, a comparative slide, because I think it's important for you to understand one important issue, which is, so Europe will solve, you can see in this slide, so this was my research on the left-hand side. So we have Europe there, a few countries that I analyzed before the new Copyright Directive, and you see that even before the new directive that will implement a digital educational exception, at least 50% of the countries that I analyzed already allowed things like sending materials via email, cloud chats. I have several examples like this, so I'm just showing you one of those educational scenarios that now are so common because of COVID. So the teacher wants to send materials via email, cloud chats, etc. And at least before the directive, at least more or less roughly half percent of Europe already allowed this. After the directive, all of them have to allow it. But now let's go to Africa. Let's go to South Asia, Asia Pacific, and let's go to Latin America. You see that the number, whereas in Europe, you at least had like 53% of the countries allowed it. In those other countries, and I have only analyzed 10 countries, so this is not a definite number, but you can see as an example, like the number of countries that would allow these uses are much smaller. And of course, this is problematic for these countries, but it's also problematic when you think about cross-border education. And you have now many students that are staying in their countries, having classes in other countries, and this simply doesn't work. There is no framework. So I know we have short time, so I'm going to finish here my presentation, but it's just to give you an idea of the differences in the legal framework and the impact that it has on online users.
Let me just quickly follow on with that, some very similar research that PIGIP has been doing. Oops, no. Around research rights. So research rights, like education rights, often is an activity that requires two different kinds of rights. So one is, can you make reproductions of a work for a research purpose without disclosing that to the general public? And the second is, can you make a private communication of that same research or a database between researchers to facilitate that public interest purpose? And this map shows kind of the disparities around the world between offering those two rights. We're looking specifically at text and data mining rights. So in the, for the COVID pandemic, TDM or text and data mining has been used in two different ways. One is the actual virus was discovered through a text and data mining project that was located in Canada, taking advantage of its broad research rights. And one of the things it did was digest and scan news reports, which are of course copyrighted works. Other kinds of projects are scanning through medical journals and books to try to find different kinds of connections that could indicate some kind of a cure or treatment. So in order to do TDM, as I mentioned, you need both a reproduction right and a sharing right, a private communication right. And so on this map, most of the countries in the world actually have some kind of a reproduction right that would apply to full works. So that is the green and blue countries. The yellow countries have a reproduction right that applies to full articles, but not full books. So you can do restrictive TDM projects in those countries. And the red countries essentially ban text and data mining by restricting even research uses, even private research uses of a right to only an excerpt. So you couldn't create a TDM database at all. But only the green countries on this map include a sharing right with that reproduction right. So if you're looking, for instance, at a cross-border research project, you could only do that between the different green countries. The rest of the countries would have to be excluded from that project because they don't provide the sharing rights that are needed for researchers to collaborate. So this is one of the areas we've been looking at that may indicate a particular international solution, especially a solution that was focused on cross-border interests. If you were to focus on the sharing aspects and implement, a similar duty as Marrakesh, a lawfully made work could be shared across borders, it would basically solve that problem for all the green, yellow, and blue countries, and even permit the uses of those databases in the red countries, even though they couldn't be created there. Let me introduce Mike Palmetto, who's been also working at PIGIP on right to research activities, but looking at impact data. What's the impact of recognizing broader research rights? So Mike, over to you to describe a little bit about that research.
All right, thanks. So I've done empirical research into the question of whether more robust copyright exceptions can be shown to be associated with the creation of more copyrighted works. I've specifically looked at the impact of exceptions on output in terms of scientific papers, and found a significant positive relationship. So the theory that is tested is that existing articles and books are a necessary input to the creation of new scientific knowledge. So copyright exceptions boost output by expanding access to the input. I'm going to share a slide real quick. The empirical story, let's see, whoa. The empirical story requires a brief explanation of how research exceptions are measured. PIGIP has done a survey of legal experts around the world asking about copyright exceptions in their countries and asking how those exceptions have changed over time. So we have data on the details of the exceptions over many years. Our survey also accounts for areas of legal uncertainty by having respondents answer questions on a 4-point scale, running from there's really no exception at all to a very certain exception. The full survey has 129 different questions, which can be disaggregated in different ways for different projects. For this particular paper on copyright exceptions pertaining to researcher access to existing works, We included questions from 5 general areas: the research exception, educational use exceptions, library use exceptions, private use exceptions, and a general exception of fair use. The mean of all these questions gives us a research index, where 0 means there's no useful exceptions for researchers at all, and 3 means there are multiple strong exceptions. There's no one got a 3 and very few got a 0. But these are all exceptions that researchers can use to obtain copyrighted works without authorization. So the study compares this research index to the amount of scientific papers published per capita in 23 countries over a 20-year period. And you can see in the bar graph on the right that there are more scientific articles per person published in countries that have more robust exceptions as measured by the research index. But the graph doesn't control for differences between countries or over time. So the real results come from regression analysis. And using panel regressions with a 2-year lag between the change in copyright law and the change in scientific output, I find that scientists residing in countries which have implemented a more robust copyright exception for research published approximately 17 to 22% more papers and books in subsequent years. I also find that the relationship is stronger in countries where you have stronger copyright laws, stronger copyright protection, and the relationship is stronger in poorer countries. Those are interested, I can send a link. A tiny link is down at the bottom. And that is, I yield back my time.
Great, thanks, Mike. So, I mean, so I think we're to the way forward, right? We've talked about the gap. There's a large number of gaps at the national level. Different countries provide different amounts of copyright exceptions that enable different kinds of very important educational and research activities by archives and museums and libraries and educational and research institutions and educators and researchers themselves. We have empirical, a growing body of empirical evidence showing that the impact of these exceptions can be significant. So Mike has done, shown some of that research, and we've done more at PIGIP and are doing more, and we've shown both economic as well as research outcomes of a better enabling environment. So the question is, what should WIPO do? And so I'd like to turn, first here, we're very honored to have Luis Villarroel with us, who's both an alumni of American University Washington College of Law, which we're very proud of, but he has held a number of other incredible titles that makes him an expert in this area, including being the General Counsel and Intellectual Property Advisor for the Minister of Education in Chile, and he was the Vice Chair of the WIPO SCCR, the body we've been talking about, in 2008, when the Limitations and Exceptions agenda that launched the Marrakesh Treaty and that is going on and focusing on this agenda was initially launched. So I think, Luis, you're the first person to, or the best person, on this panel in many ways to comment on what WIPO can do. So, given your experience and the progress of the LNE agenda, what do you think that it's possible to achieve there when WIPO resumes, when the SCCR resumes?
There you go. Well, thank you, Sean. It's a really pleasure to be here and with this awesome panel of. Well, I would like to start, saying that the WIPO agenda of exceptions it started, much earlier. It started in 2003 with the proposal that I had the pleasure to introduce of bringing to WIPO the issue of exceptions. To have an idea, today, if you go to the WIPO website, you will see, an SSCR, and all the documents are about exceptions. So exception is a really important topic in WIPO. At that time, in 2003, we had to fight to get it as one issue within the other issues to review in the agenda in 2003. And now we have come a long way with a great success. And I think that with COVID has brought us into a situation where we can really make faster progress in WIPO, because we started the issue of access to knowledge. We needed to copyright exceptions to provide access to culture. And also we were thinking on the need of cross-border issues. But now copyright exceptions is an issue of access to life. No longer is just an issue of culture. If somebody cannot go to I mean, if somebody has to go to a library to get a book, or even the library to send the book to someone at home, you know, you will be spreading the virus. So really, it's a key health issue. And so from access to knowledge to access to life, we also have to frame not an issue of access, you know, to cross-border issue. It's an issue of cross-street issues, you know, because it now it's also a critical issue how you distribute and make available the works within a country, even within a city. So what can we do? Well, we have seen that there are leadership that are being that are taking place outside WIPO, and I think that is very embarrassing from WIPO. You know, we have the World Health Organization that has called for what is called the CTAP. This is COVID Technology Access Pool that requires country to provide a free access or open licensing for all the knowledge related to COVID. And that includes patent and copyright. Also, we have a proposal going on in TRIPS Council now, is the Indian and South Africa proposal that is asking sort of like to waive copyright liability as long as COVID is taking place for works for authors. So we see that it's an environment where what we really can make, you know, the step that we were missing. We have seen that WIPO has advanced. You know, we had a golden era of treaties that go for 2008 when it was the World Blind Union proposal to 2013, where we in 4 years we achieved the treaty, and then we sort of like we advanced on knowledge, but not a norm setting. We have a lot of studies, but we have not had not even a resolution. But the sense of urgency because of COVID bring us again to the light, and I'm sure that the next SSCR we will have a much more sensible delegations, and I think that we have to accelerate that sense of urgency, working in each of our countries, asking political leaders, you know, that have the power to bring the attention to delegations, is to provide resolution and mandate to have a special fast track for these exceptions that will enable a new society that will be more safe on access to knowledge. So we can also think on including in the discussion the issue of national security. And because of national security, a lot of the barriers of copyright or the alleged barriers will be diminished. So my take is that we should work on proposing resolutions in national governments, you know, and the Congress or political, asking the foreign affairs ministries going to WIPO just to do something to bring WIPO to the solution, not to being part of the problem. And of course, we should also work with health experts that will provide more information on the dangers of not facilitating, you know, digital transmission of works to provide access, which in the case of in many countries has been explained is completely out of, it's not a legal possibility, particularly in Latin America. So I guess I will stop here because I think that we can have more discussion hearing your reactions to my points, but happy to complement.
Great. Thank you, Luis. And let me just, I texted to the audience, but this is a very tight schedule. As I mentioned in the onset, I've shared an address of a Zoom room where some of us will go after this meeting to answer more questions and have a more kind of free-flowing discussion after this meeting. But so in the last few minutes that we have, I'd like to turn to Jean and then Nicola and Stephen to maybe each mention, just one component of the policy proposals that you've been developing before WIPO that might be most important to focus on given COVID. Jean, you first.
Thanks. Now, I'd already mentioned, I'm looking at things from an archival perspective, which is my mandate. I've already mentioned that only a third of WIPO member states can copy archival material for research and study. This is not only as a fundamental barrier, it's shocking that you can't copy stuff just for research. But even more shocking is that only 2/3 of WIPO members can legally copy archival material for preservation. For preservation, not for dissemination, but simply to ensure that at-risk originals can be copied to ensure that they'll continue to be available for future generations. This is absolutely vital for digital formats that must be migrated to new platforms as software and hardware become obsolete and preferably before bits rot. So while nations can address these issues individually, only an international treaty can ensure that there's a consistent level of exceptions globally to ensure that our global cultural heritage can be preserved and made available for research. Last year's conference and regional consultations that were organized by WIPO revealed wide support for an international instrument to address copying for preservation of global cultural heritage in the holdings of libraries, archives, and museums. So we must build on the momentum that started at those conferences so that libraries, archives, and museums can fulfill their core mission to ensure that our cultural heritage is available for future generations. If nothing else, let's be able to copy for preservation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. Nicola, what would you add from the perspective of an educator?
Yes, so some of you might know, like it was mentioned in the program. So education and research sector has put forward a treaty on exceptions and limitations for education and research activities at WIPO. And I think like the most important issues in terms of the context of COVID is really to update national legislation to address the use of digital works. And as part of this, of course, and that there are no additional obligations placed on digital works that you usually don't find for our work with analog materials. And in addition, of course, the cross-border collaboration and exchange, because that's just something that's happening now and that has just really increased during COVID. So these, I think, would be my two big points from the treaty that would be really important to address. And I think only an international instrument can really promote national level reforms as well as address the international challenge that we can only face together as an international community, to move forward as societies during COVID, but also beyond.
Thank you. Stephen, what would you add to that agenda?
Yes, so I fully echo both what Gina and Nicola have said, and that there's very much this sense of unfinished business for Marrakesh. So I think in particular for libraries, the value of having an international instrument helps in that cross-border contact aspect, partly because a lot of our heritage is spread across borders, partly because what's on the internet is difficult to cite anyway. It's also vital for libraries to be able to form those cross-border preservation networks that mean that it isn't just the content of the big, often European or American institutions that's being digitized and shared, that there's material available for everyone around the world, so that all cultures, all voices can actually be available to support research and learning when new waves of coronavirus come, when the next pandemic comes. Secondly, international action can offer clarity, both to governments in terms of what sort of laws they can pass, what sort of provisions they can pass, but also clearly for libraries, archives, educators who too often are given rights by governments but see them taken away by contract terms, especially for digital tools. So there's really a potential there to offer greater clarity and to make sure that what can be done, make sure that libraries can work, libraries, archives, education institutions, others can work internationally, and just take advantage, to make use of all the potential the digital brings and basically what users expect from it.
I've shared in the chat with everyone a couple links to how you can get more information from PIGIP and how you can join the Education and Research Treaty. Stephen or Jean, is there any particular link or source you'd like to share with people interested in the library and archives effort more particularly?
Not at this time, no.
What we can do is we can include into the link, and this is clearly focusing on the longer term climate change aspect, but I think so we do have work which you shared on the importance of international action on preservation for climate change, but as we've seen, digital provides a solution to so many of these challenges, from climate change to COVID. So let me find that and I'll put it in the chat now.
I've shared the site for IFLA, which has a lot of great information on the Library, Archives, and Museums Treaty, and you can find a running blog there, and there's a lot of up-to-date information. So let me thank all of our panelists and invite you to meet me over. I'll share the link one more time into an open Zoom room where we won't get cut off, but this meeting is going to end very promptly. So let me just, before we get cut off, share. I'm just going to share the link right to all the panelists and to us. That's the Zoom room. You can join us in just a few minutes, and we'll be happy to answer your questions. I'm sorry we didn't have a lot of questions or a lot of time for questions today, but we really welcome you to join us in the next Zoom room. And thank you very much to all of our panelists, and also to our 23 attendees who are here, in addition to the panelists and moderators. So, and there's a link in the chat to IFLA's blog. Thank you again, everybody. We hope to see you very shortly if you'd like to discuss further. Thank you.